Okay, my thanks to Miho and Paul and all the other organisers for the opportunity to speak. Sorry for the fact that I'm struggling with a cold, so I'm going to wheeze my way through this. And also I suspect there is some overlap with some of what Michael Taft was saying earlier this morning. I suspect there'll also be some overlap with what Tom O'Connor is going to be talking about tomorrow. It's a much more speculative presentation than Connor's very rich and detailed analysis, dissection of Irish capitalism. It's trying to work out in a more systematic manner how we might approach a particular problem that is of both, I would say, theoretical and practical interest, and really essentially why there has not been more protest against what is an egregious set of austerity and illegitimate debts that have landed on the backs of Irish people. And of course, I'm using the by now cliched quote from Sherlock Holmes, or from the Arthur Conan Doyle short story Silver Blaze, where Holmes famously refers to the curious incident of the dog in the night time, the curious incident being why the dog didn't bark. So sometimes the dog not barking is at least as interesting as the dog that is barking. And I'm not sure how well this has come out. This is from the ever-excellent Jean Kerrigan, writing in the ever-not excellent Sunday Independent a few weeks ago. And it's kind of it's remarking on the fact, again, that the absence of protest against debt and austerity in the Irish context, and it's suggesting this kind of satirical pastiche where our lords and masters are suggesting that maybe, if we actually said we're going to reintroduce bank bonuses, that this would actually be seen as pushing it too far, that you might actually end up tipping people over the edge, and they might actually end up out in the streets and engaged in mass protest. But that prospect being, of course, poo-pooed by the fact that the notion of the fighting Irish is in fact a myth. And in large part, in recent times, that's true. And what I'm interested in is why that's been true. Michael mentioned earlier the Anglo Not Our Debt campaign that I've been very involved in. I'm going to draw from that campaign to illustrate some of the particular examples that I'm going to use for the purposes of trying to elucidate this problem, or work out why this problem exists in the form that it does. Important point of what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to talk to a great extent about the way in which the space for resistance is corralled or limited. And that obviously is a very important part of the equation. Conor talked about the way in which the financial sector operates and places severe limits on the space for people to protest, in part through the lack of transparency, opaque nature of the instruments used and so on, but also how policy, through a good example at the moment is the fiscal treaty, how policy seeks to institutionalise parameters within which, or delimit the possibility for dissent. Another starting point or orientation of the paper and the work I hope to develop is that I'm very sceptical of unidimensional claimed explanations, that the explanation for the relative lack of resistance can be laid at the door of quiescent trade union leadership, or that it's some kind of innate Irish instinct towards quiescence or towards apathy. And I'd say I think it has both theoretical and practical implications. I'm trying to map out a research agenda, but I'm also trying to identify some practical barriers to political progress that I, and I think many other people here, have come across, especially in recent years. And I'm dividing the types of barrier to protest, or the explanations as to why there's been limited protest, into two categories. One, I'm rather vaguely and wholly unsatisfactorily, but I can't quite think of a better term yet, dividing up into what you might term states of mind, and I'll run through each of these in turn. Is it something to do with claimed Irish fatalism? Is it something to do with Catholic guilt, conservatism? Is it something to do with fear? Is it something to do with an individualised ethos? Is it something to do with our attitudes to Europe? What links all these is that, of course, they're relatively intangible, they're very difficult things to measure. Slightly more measurable are a set of what I'm terming structural or reagential factors that serve to limit the amount of protest that is available. or that is happening. We'll talk briefly there about immigration, the role of the media, that was talked about earlier this morning as well, the role of academics and intellectuals, the role of political parties and the electoral process, and the aforementioned trade union actions and civil society more broadly. Now, of course, this is an artificial distinction, because questions of fear, questions of fatalism also impinge upon the attitudes of academics and the attitudes of civil society leaderships. So it's a rough and not by no means very satisfactory dividing line, but it's what I'm going to stick with for the moment in the hope that we can maybe refine it as we go along. Let's start with fatalism. Probably the best example of that recently was the recent article by Fintan O'Toole, who was drawing from the 40, 50 years old work of Heinrich Böll, the German writer, analysing the Irish personality and basically saying that what characterises the Irish response to whatever goes wrong is, well, it could be worse. Something worse could have happened. Whereas the German attitude is, this is the worst thing that could possibly have happened. And what O'Toole's argument here is that this is why we've had so little protest in the Irish context. We always think, well, yes, this is savage, this is unjust, but in the context of the current Eurozone crisis, we could be Greece. You know, things could be even worse, and that therefore serves as a barrier to protest. Now, there's probably something in it, but it was kind of a starting point when I was thinking about writing this paper. It struck me as a perfect example of a unidimensional and essentialist explanation, because it doesn't explain why protest does periodically occur. Why was there a mass boycott of the House of Charge? Why were there mass marches against austerity in the opening phases of the crisis? It doesn't explain, even if you regard those as exceptions, they're pretty significant exceptions, and they would suggest that fatalism or a fatalistic attitude is not set in stone. Is it to do with a sense of guilt? First quote here is the late Brian Lenihan, who famously, of course, remarked, "We all party," or as Enda Kenny, in his own eloquent, poetic way, said at the Davos Forum, people went mad borrowing. And of course, also Enda equally later remarked, "We'll pay our dues in full and on time," which speaks to perhaps a certain sense of conservatism, in the sense that we do honour our obligations even if those obligations seem severe and particularly onerous. I think Lenin is often parodied and criticised for the "we all partied" line, but I actually think it was more insightful than perhaps even he realised, because I do think there is an element of that there, a sense of that, as Frank McNally has remarked in his Irishman's Diary occasionally, the worst charge you can level against an Irish person is that he or she lost the run of themselves. And I think there is perhaps a residual sense that we did to some extent lose the run of ourselves, and that we are dealing with the aftermath of that to a certain extent. The historian Peter Gray has described elsewhere, used the metaphor of a thin trickle of fact to keep a morass of cliches from drying out entirely. And in a sense, I think that's probably what's at work here. Now, of course, we have to try and combat that by pointing out that if people did engage in excessive spending on houses, for example, what actual gain did they actually experience from that in terms of what they're now struggling with? And that the other side of that coin, of course, is that if people went mad borrowing, then other people must have gone mad lending, and they are not being asked, as Conor's example illustrated, they are not being asked to carry or bear the consequences of their actions. And of course, when Enda says we pay our dues in full and on time, we have to ask the question, are these our dues? Hence the Anglo Not Our Debt campaign. The fear factor is definitely there as well. Again, it's a difficult one to measure. Mortgage arrears, as Michael talked about earlier, are clearly part of that equation. Unemployment, the threat of unemployment, and the increasingly precarious nature of employment. And I suspect this will be touched upon in the paper by Turner or Sullivan later on the joint labour councils. And of course, especially perhaps in the context of the fiscal treaty and some of the other debates in this area, the fear factor that we will be thrown out of the euro, that the ATM machines will dry up and so on, is also part I suspect, of what is at work here. And we'll hear a lot more about that in the run-up to the 31st of May and the fiscal treaty referendum. Individualisation, I think, is, again, is a very intangible one, but it must be part of what is going on here, built around a decades-long erosion of the idea of collective action, the feasibility or desirability of collective action. And I think I take Conor's point that Ireland has been practicing a version of comprador neoliberalism for many decades, since the foundation of the state, perhaps even earlier. But at a popular cultural level, I think that cult of individualisation has gathered apace in Ireland and, of course, more broadly, globally, in recent times, built around not just the economics of neoliberalism and financialisation, but also around a cultural shift towards neoliberalism, call it the X factor at work, or whatever you want to call it, but very much tied in also to a notion of what Mark Fisher, writing about capitalist realism in the context of, in particular, education, talks about a kind of a business ontology in which it is simply obvious, and here we're broaching something I'll come back to in a moment, which is kind of Gramscian notions of common sense, that it is simply common sense that everything in society, every public service, including healthcare and education, should be run as a business. And I suspect Marnie Holber's paper on the corporate restructuring of third level education will, I suspect, touch on that after the lunch break. And any of us, of course, who work in the educational sector are very aware of, even where we do not work in private colleges, we still continue to work in public institutions, but are increasingly run along capitalist performance management, individualised performance assessment lines. And the final kind of intangible state of mind that I suspect must have some role to play in limiting the possibility of protest against debt and austerity is this notion of an attachment to the European Union as a good thing, which has been positive for Ireland. Some of you may have seen the satirical ad produced by, I think it's Dole TV, on the fiscal treaty, where somebody starts out very moderately arguing in favour of the treaty, and then suddenly breaks down and says, you know, what the fuck are you thinking of, these muppets? You want to go back to paedophile priests and Aaron sweaters and break away from all the good things about Europe. But of course there's a more serious truth perhaps in that, in terms of the notion of Europe having been discursively constructed as a positive element, and has always been a positive element in Irish public life. Now, of course, I think of all the states of mind, whether it's fear, guilt, conservatism, I think that state of mind is the one that most obviously shines boat, not just in Ireland, but right across Europe, as the myth of social Europe becomes increasingly unsustainable in the light of the hardline response to the crisis. Something that I think had become unsustainable to many of us long before then, but I think is becoming much more obvious to more and more people, but not necessarily to be translated into a progressive political project, which I'll come back to. Okay, those are the kinds of states of mind that I think are playing a role in terms of limiting or delimiting the extent of resistance. Let's turn to the more substantive or tangible factors. Well, again, Conor's point about long histories of certain systems being in place, the extent to which emigration is and always has acted as a kind of a safety valve for Irish capitalism in a crisis context. Emigration now estimated to be running at some 40,000 per annum. My own feeling is that, just anecdotally, that those figures will probably be revised fairly substantially upwards this year. What is the impact of that? Well, of course, it depends on who leaves. Some of you may know the origins of this particular quote. It's from a conversation that allegedly took place between Peadar O'Donnell and Eamon de Valera, where O'Donnell had written articles very critical of de Valera in the 1960s, and pointing out that the disastrous socio-economic legacy of de Valera's period as Taoiseach. De Valera allegedly rang O'Donnell and said, "You were very harsh on me, Peadar." O'Donnell says, "Well, let's face it, 500,000 people emigrated when you were Taoiseach." And de Valera said, "Yeah, Peadar, but sure, if you'd been Taoiseach, 500,000 people would have emigrated too." To which O'Donnell is alleged to have famously responded, "Yes, Eamon, but not the same 500,000 And so it's a pleasant fantasy that I sometimes like to have as to who we could have got rid of and who might still be here. In any event, the availability, it obviously has a differentiated impact depending on who leaves, but the very fact that it's available as an option clearly plays a role in limiting the extent of resistance. The media has been talked about already, and I do think we need to engage with this in a very serious way. And in a sense, in part, what I'm doing here is a very superficial, as yet, and rather glib way, but I would like to maybe work with media researchers on this, because clearly this is playing a huge role in the current crisis. This is a quote from Morgan Kelly, my colleague in UCD, who, unlike Brian Lucy, did see this disaster coming, talking about when the Troika arrived, when the first so-called bailout was agreed, the IMF, it transpires, were actually quite in favour of at least some burning of bondholders. They were quite willing to countenance some write-down of bondholder debt. It was greeted with great welcome by Brian Lennon, again, but it was torpedoed, but from what Kelly describes as an unexpected direction. Timothy Geithner, the US Treasury Secretary, said, no way. And that line, of course, has since been upheld very firmly and very staunchly by the European Central Bank. But in the first instance, it came from Geithner. Now, at the time when Morgan printed this, I was kind of, why? Because we don't know who the bondholders are. Sheila Killian will be talking about the audit of Irish debt later today. We don't know who the bondholders are, but as far as we can tell from anecdotal evidence, it's European financial institutions. However, it subsequently transpired, so this partly goes, Colin mentioned Jim Stewart's work in Trinity. His and others' speculation would be, yes, it is mainly European financial institutions who are the bondholders, but they are insured through credit default swaps by US banks, by Goldman Sachs, by JP Morgan, etc. And that was why Geithner had a horse in this race. Now, you might think this was a story. It seems like a pretty important thing. And yet, when Michael Noonan met with Timothy Geithner in June 2011, he was subsequently interviewed, and I use the word advisedly, by RTE's Washington correspondent, who started to ask Michael Noonan a question. His influence was discussed quite widely after an article saying that he intervened. We'll put that aside because we don't know that he intervened, we haven't got the evidence. So he actually starts to almost ask a question, and then he withdraws the question before he even asks it. And it's to me, I know it may seem like a trivial example, but it is a huge example. This is one of the most important decisions, one of the most important aspects of the most important economic decision ever made by the Irish state, and yet the national broadcaster can't even work up the nerve to ask a question about it. Michael Taft made some very complimentary remarks about the Anglo Not Our Debt campaign. From the inside looking out, we kind of don't feel we've achieved an awful lot at one level. On the 31st of March, the promissory note payment of 3.1 billion that was due was in fact paid. Now, you may have read a lot of coverage in the newspapers, media, that it was deferred, that Ireland got a deferral. Ireland did not get a deferral. That payment was made. It was just paid from a different bank account. It was paid from NAMA, which we own. So it wasn't deferred. And furthermore, the Irish government promised to repay the money to NAMA by issuing a sovereign bond. So what had previously been soft debt was turned into hard debt. You can default on a sovereign bond, and I think we should, but it's a harder thing to do than the form the debt had previously been in. So not only was it a scam, it was also a stitch-up. And yet, I was driving to Leitrim from that night and going increasingly mad as I was listening to Drive Time on RTE Radio, which reaches its apogee when a political journalist said, and I would not be surprised if Michael Noonan walks on water across the Liffey into the Fine Gael Convention Centre tonight, given the coup he has pulled off today. Part of the difficulty here, and it's maybe something that Mimi Doran will be addressing when she's talking about media work later on, is that there's an expert discourse here. Anglo Not Our Debt, a lot of our spokespeople are community workers, they're people involved in global justice organisations. They've turned themselves into experts on promissory notes, emergency liquidity assistance, but they're not recognised as such. So financial journalists, economists, including some who famously were cheerleaders and boosters for this regime during its heyday, are turned to as experts, even if they don't know anything about this particular issue. And of course, the other aspect of the media role in this regard is the demonisation of dissent, whether that's the demonisation of protesters at the Labour Party convention in Galway, or whether it's what I was talking about here 2 years ago, the demonisation of protesters over the Corrib gas dispute. So again, placing very firm restrictions on the level of dissent, or at least the way in which dissent can be channeled into the public discourse. Final example, just I wanted to give this in the context of being in a referendum campaign. 13th June 2008, the gnashing and wailing from the national broadcaster after the first Lisbon no. Fergal Keane helpfully said there were looks of horror from many people in Europe. On the 6-1 News, Sean Whelan essentially framing the problem as that then Foreign Affairs Minister Micheál Martin would have when he went to Europe to try and explain the outcome. And Sean O'Rourke's pithy question to Michael Noonan, what went wrong? Or, to put it slightly differently, after Lisbon 2, Mary Wilson on 5-7 Live saying to, I can't remember which government minister it was after the yes vote, so relief all round then. Indeed. The role of academics and intellectuals has been talked about, and again this has to be part of the picture. This is a quote from The Guardian from a few weeks ago from Aditya Chakraborty, and what he's talking about is the British Sociological Association conference. And he had a look at their programme, and he was arguing, this should be sociology's time, you'd think, wouldn't it? In terms of addressing what is clearly a failure of economics. But they actually ended up devoting as much time to the holistic massage industry from a Foucauldian perspective. And don't get me wrong, I'm all in favour of Foucauldian perspectives, they can be very valuable. And I'm all in favour of massages as well, but I'm not that sure that this is a particularly useful line of study. But they're never going to challenge the dominance of mainstream economics, and it's hard to believe they really want to. And I fear a similar comment could be made about, certainly I work in a politics and international relations department, where the willingness to engage with what Benjamin Cox called really big questions, or a version of critical theory, is quite staggering. And it's probably become more so in the context of the aforementioned business ontologies that have dominated academic life in recent times. Not exclusive. This was a letter that I managed to get a large number of academics to sign around the Anglo Not Our Debt issue. So there is a constituency out there that is willing to put its name to radical demands. And I should also mention, just given the news events of the last few days, you've got people in there like Breach Connolly and Lawrence Cox and Theresa O'Keefe from the National University of Ireland Maynooth, who I think deserve special credit in recent days for having put their head above the parapet on the defence of a postgraduate student caught up in the Corrib red tape controversy, and a willingness to actually take considerable risks to defend her interests. So it's not a homogeneous picture. There are openings and exceptions. In terms of elections, again, the limitations on dissent, the limitations on protest may in part stem from the disillusion of the last year's election and the change that was not delivered, and perhaps more generally a disillusionment with political parties. And of course that's the real damage. The fact that the Greens and the Labour Party destroy themselves by participation in government is neither here nor there. The real damage they do is that they damage people's belief in the possibility of political change. Might that change again? Looking at the breakup of the Dutch government, you've got the Dutch Socialist Dutch Left Party at 20% in the opinion polls at the moment, but that can be deceiving. Mélenchon in France was almost on 20% at one stage in the opinion polls, ended up going down to about 11%. Marine Le Pen's vote was really, in part, I would argue, because she was better able to articulate and mobilise protest by embracing a language of populism and nationalism. I'll come back to that very briefly in a moment because I'm moving towards conclusion here. We've talked about the trade union leadership. Michael also has made the point that there are dissenting trade union voices here. Unite, Mandate and the TEEU have all come out against the fiscal treaty. SIPTU, of course, has said that they see themselves, as Jack O'Connor said, they see themselves as being between a rock and a hard place on the treaty, and I can see the logic of that argument, except that I don't think the appropriate response in that situation is to crawl under the rock, which is essentially what they've ended up doing. But it does beg questions about whether the left should support the Croke Park Agreement, given that that's been the main device in the last few years for keeping public sector unions cowed and quiet. But it extends beyond the trade unions, and it extends also into civil society more broadly. The Claiming Our Future initiative that came on the scene a couple of years ago, essentially also subscribing to a very cooperative, elite-led phenomenon that saw itself in partnership with government, or at least in partnership with a government in waiting. And there are broader questions there in terms of civil society's long-term relationship with the state, going back to what I've termed states of mind, but also issues of post-colonialism, in the way in which the flowering of Irish civil society at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century was in hostility to colonialism in large part, and then once that link was broken, for part of the country at least, how it became much more allied to the interests of the newly independent state. Mary Murphy in Minute also have written very interestingly on this. Okay, so summarising. States of mind. Fatalism is definitely there, but it can be an essentialised explanatory factor. It can probably only be countered with examples of victories that can be built upon. The guilt and the conservatism is certainly there also, and can probably only be combated in part by repetition of the argument that it's not, we have nothing to be guilty about. I'd like to say we chose the slogan Anglo Not Our Debt, precisely with that constructive, discursive focus in mind. In fact, we chose it after a 5-hour meeting, couldn't come up with anything better. But in a sense, you can also witness, I think, how conservatism, what seems like a very solid conservatism, can be transformed. The Rossport community protest against the Shell pipeline consists of what some of the most would have seen themselves as some of the most conservative farmers and school teachers in the country, and have found themselves objectively in a very radical position. Or the other more recent example, my absolute shock to discover that my 86-year-old Fine Gael voting father had not paid the household charge and had no intention of paying it. In terms of overcoming fear, I think the counterpart to fear is anger. I've been listening round the clock recently to Bruce Springsteen's new Wrecking Ball album, which takes its title track from the destruction of the Giant Stadium in New Jersey, but urging people to hold tight to your anger and don't fall to your fear. And I think anger and fear is really how the fiscal treaty is going to be played out, I think. If anger wins, it's a no. If fear wins, it's a yes. And I think this notion that anger, and again it goes back to mainstream media discourse, that anger is a bad thing, has to be gotten away from. Anger is a very good thing. Individualisation, need for re-experience of collective action, attitudes to Europe, that's gone. The only question is whether the reaction to it is right or left. Immigration, it's obviously a chicken and egg scenario. I'll skim through these. The media, I think Mimi Doran will be talking about the media. I think it's easier for localised campaigns to access the media than it is for ones that are systemically calling the system into account. I think there might, while academics and intellectuals can easily be blamed for not engaging more with popular struggle perhaps doesn't always seek to engage academics or intellectuals. Next election will be very different, obviously, from the last one. And there's a question of whether the left should appeal in more national terms. I don't think it's a coincidence that Sinn Féin is doing best of the opposition parties at the moment, in part because it is speaking that language of nationalist opposition. And I think in civil society's case, we need to construct alternative, organic alliances that move away from looking to trade union leaders for leadership, but drawing on much more horizontal type movements based on Latin American and other examples. Do I have 2 minutes? Yeah, great. And I think Tom Boland's going to be talking about shared values and symbols, and I think that really provides an interesting example. The Occupy and Unlock NAMA movements are also relevant there. These are the member organisations of the Debt Justice Action Network, which is the membership of the Anglo Not Our Debt campaign. You've got Fermoy says no to bondholder bailouts. You've got the Irish Missionary Union, you've got the Little Sisters of the Assumption, you've got Unite the Trade Union, you've got the Kilbarrack Community Development Programme. I do think it's a very interesting example of a kind of organic civil society coalition in terms of breaking away from some of the more traditional models of how those are organised. And it calls to mind, obviously, the deeply sexist exchange between Samuel Johnson and Boswell about women preaching and dogs walking on two legs. When you see a dog walking on two legs, you don't ask, is it doing it well? You ask, it's the very fact that it's doing it that's actually important. And in a sense, I think some of those civil society coalitions, this may also apply to the Occupy, certainly I think applies to Unlock NAMA, but it's their existence that actually is as important perhaps as the message or the success that they do or don't achieve. In conclusion, I think what we have to accept vis-a-vis the reality of what is a very serious set of obstacles to the expression of dissent and opposition in Ireland is that we're in a war of position, to use the Gramscian term. It's a long-haul struggle to strengthen the position of subordinate classes across culture, intellectually, economically, politically, to combat what are widely received notions of common sense. And I think Owen Wirth's paper tomorrow will be talking about austerity as common sense. And in that, I think we have to avoid two extremes, that there is some innate characteristic that renders resistance impossible or unfeasible, but equally that some alternative political project can be achieved over any short-term time period. I genuinely doubt that's the case, given the very significant obstacles to debt and austerity, to resistance to debt and austerity in the Irish context.